Hello and welcome to Is Climate Change Your Concern? A podcast where we discuss approaches to climate action and explore practical actions that benefit both our well-being and the health of our planet. I'm your host Anirudh Nanda, and join me each week as we embark on this journey to turn concern into action. Do you find it difficult to effectively communicate about climate change? Does the urgency of the crisis sometimes seem lost on those around you? Or perhaps you are unsure how to inspire climate action without resorting to doom and gloom? If you've nodded yes to any of these questions, you are not alone. More and more people are finding it challenging to navigate conversations about our changing climate. And to help us tackle these challenges, we have a special guest, Shel Winkley. Shel is a weather and climate engagement specialist at Climate Central and a former broadcast meteorologist with over 17 years of experience. He has earned multiple awards from the Texas Association of Broadcasters and was also featured in The Atlantic for his role communicating the science of climate change. Today, Shel will share his invaluable insights on effectively communicating complex climate information to diverse audiences. Also, stay till the end to listen to my takeaways from this enlightening conversation. Thank you so much, Shel, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate you including me in the conversation.
Shel, can we begin by understanding what climate communications is and its importance?
Sure. So there's plenty of reports, and we can go into it if you want to, but there's plenty of reports that prove that humans have categorically accelerated the changing climate that we have, right? Between the burning of things like oil and gas and adding fossil fuels to the atmosphere, polluting our atmosphere. So climate communication is working with that science, working with the data, and making it relatable so that we can have conversations around climate change and so that we can start working on adapting to climate change and then also mitigating the warming climate that we have for future generations to come.
And as a meteorologist, you've reported on extreme weather events, including hurricanes, record-breaking back-to-back summers. So can you discuss your experience from the perspective of climate communications?
Sure. So, I graduated college in 2007, and we learned about climate change, but not like the understanding we have now, right? So when I became a broadcast meteorologist in 2007 in Amarillo, Texas, we weren't talking about climate change like we're talking about it today. I remember when I came to Bryan College Station, Texas, to work for the CBS affiliate, where I spent 15 years of my career. And Amarillo, Texas, and the Texas Panhandle had a lot of severe weather. Southeast Texas and Central Texas had some severe weather, but not the same at the time. And I remember going into my news director's office, and I had all these ideas, and he was like, "Okay, slow down. We don't get that much severe weather here." But over time, with climate change doing things like shifting our dry line in Texas to the east, which the dry line is basically the division between very humid, unstable Gulf of Mexico air and very dry desert air coming off the foothills of the Rockies and the Mexican plateau. And when you have those collisions, that's where you can get some big thunderstorm development. So that shifting east into Texas now puts bigger thunderstorms, bigger implications closer to higher population centers, places like Dallas and Austin, Texas, and San Antonio, Texas, and then drifting into our area that we covered. So you can just see the bigger implications and then understand that something has changed and that something now impacts you more. So it's the severe weather, Hurricane Harvey dumping 50 inches of rain on top of us and having to cover that for 3 days with flooding and inland tornadoes. If you remember or heard about the February 2021 freeze that hit Texas and then pretty much crippled the state's power grid, that has a climate aspect because we know that climate change is making, the jet stream looser and allowing those big Arctic cold snaps to come down more often. And then I think the biggest thing that drove me from being an operational broadcast meteorologist to focusing on climate change is in 2011, I covered one of the worst droughts and heat waves in Texas history. And then in 2022, I covered it again, and the heat tied 2011. And then in 2023, I covered it again, but this time it just shattered every heat record that we have. And at least for where I was forecasting for, those records go back to 1882. So it was very easy to see the climate impact on the day-to-day weather and how much it had changed that weather as well.
Now that we're talking about how weather is has broadly changed over the period of time, and it has affected our daily lives in so many ways, and obviously the extreme weather events, I realize that the science behind it can be quite overwhelming for general population to understand. So before we dive into what is the best way to talk about it, can you summarize some of the basic understandings that one might want to know before they want to talk about climate change?
Yeah, so I think the advantage, it's kind of like weather forecasting itself. Like when I started as a meteorologist, you can make a pretty good 3-day forecast. 5-day was okay, 7-day was a bit iffy, right? Now we can make 10-day forecasts with pretty good precision. It's the same with climate science. So we now have attribution science tools that we can lay into the forecast. And so we can see it days ahead. If there's a lot of heat that will be coming, we can now look at that and say, we know with a pretty good amount of, finality that this was probably going to be a warmer day anyway. But now we have the ability to say, but climate change now makes it this much more likely, or to be a hotter day. Or world weather attribution's doing great work. They can look retrospectively. It could be a heat wave, it could be a flooding event, it could be a hurricane, and we can go back and we can look and see how much climate change impacted that event or that storm in order to make it more intense for the places that it impacted as well. We've got a great thing at Climate Central. It's a tool called the Climate Shift Index. So it takes that attribution science, it puts it into the forecast, and it gives us an understanding. Right now in Texas, to yesterday, we had a heat index of 107. Houston had a heat index of 115. We had highs in the 90s, which I know, looking at the weather in parts of India, that seems like a pretty cool day recently. But we know that the weather like that yesterday at this time in late May was made 5 times more likely to happen at this time of the year in this part of the country, in this part of the globe, because of the impacts of adding extra carbon to the atmosphere.
Now that we know the magnitude of the problem is so huge, and the results are established that it touches every aspect of our lives, but I still think that people struggle to effectively communicate about it. Would you want to share some of the best practices from your experience communicating climate science?
Yeah, sure. So I think my most successful way that I have communicated climate change is by, it's a big problem, right? I can say 2023 was the hottest year for the globe. That's a very big problem for your mind to wrap around. It can make it feel a little disparaging, and you might not have a way of doing anything about it. Or it just may seem like a big problem that's impacting other parts of the world and not you. So the way that I do it is localize it. Why does it matter for where you are? One of the most recent examples of that. Do you know what a crawfish is? You ever had crawfish?
I've heard of it. Yes. Mardi
Okay,
Gras.
so crawfish, Mardi Gras. Think about them like little tiny lobsters, right? So Mardi Gras, and in the spring, everybody likes eating crawfish. Well, last summer's heat wave in Louisiana severely crippled the crop of crawfish between the drought and the heat. And then we had the winter cold snap that was, pretty significant in January. So that even hurt it more for what little crop was there. So by the time we got to Mardi Gras, when everybody loves to eat crawfish, there were no crawfish to be found. And it's those moments when everyone's asking why, or why are they so expensive? Take the things that people know and people love and that they notice is different or changing, and use those moments to say, this is why. Let me show you the science. Let me show you the data that tells us that a changing climate is impacting you in this way. We have bluebonnets, which is a wildflower here in Texas. It's the state flower, right? My first big moment of climate communication was when in January we had bluebonnets coming up. Those usually come up in March. They're a springtime flower. What we know with an earlier arriving spring and a warming spring is that we can get these very warm temperatures earlier. But here in the States, at least, you still probably can get a freeze through March or April. So we had bluebonnets coming up. Everybody's taking their Instagram pictures. Everyone's loving it. And then we had a freeze and they all died. And everybody was severely disappointed. And that was a moment to say, this is a thing that you love. This is you being impacted by climate change. Not to say it's always going to happen, but like these are the real world implications of a warming climate.
I think it's an important aspect to understand your audience and, then tailor your message. But at the same time, we all hear about psychological barriers. Everyone's busy in their own lives. We all have our own problems. And then, life stuff. So at that particular point of time, climate change can feel distant. Did you have any particular framework, or would you recommend something to the listeners with which they can benefit as to how to move beyond psychological barriers?
It's a great question. And I think it comes down to a couple of things. It's generational, right? Maybe I talked about it this weekend with my extended family. He's older and he said, hey, I can kind of see things are changing, but that's not for me to worry about. That's for your generation to worry about. And not really, because your generation is leaving a planet to my generation and your grandchildren's generation and the generations after that. And yeah, people are busy. People have their lives. People are focused maybe on work because they're more worried about where their next meal comes from, how to keep the lights on, how to keep the air conditioner running when it's a very hot day and the prices are going up. So again, I think finding those little moments, not to belittle anybody because they're not talking about climate change, but just to say, when someone says, oh, it's hot one today, it seems like it's been extra hot. Well, yes, it has been. We know that this is climate change because XYZ. It doesn't have to be a super long conversation. It can just be those little moments. And if the conversation goes forward from there, great. But it's just, how do we normalize it? How do we normalize this conversation so that it then continues to become bigger conversations?
Moving beyond conversations, and just understanding the role of storytelling. Because at the end of the day, I believe your job was also to package an incident as a story which is digestible. So I would be curious to understand what role can stories play, because at the same time, while we are communicating with one another, can stories play a far more effective role? Or so to say, we could more talk about personal experiences that would be more effective.
Right, absolutely. The way, journalism 101 teaches you when you're putting together a story for TV, for print, whatever you're doing, it's kind of the same idea as what I said about localizing that impact, right? The globe's big, home is tiny and is understandable to you. So when we put together stories, we talk about the overarching. What is the big thing we want to talk about? Climate change. Okay. So we know the big, and maybe we go and we talk to a scientist who can tell us about the specific aspect of climate change. The other part of that story, we call it a two-source story, is finding that human element. Okay, so we know that summers are getting hotter. This scientist tells us that. Okay, maybe my mind can wrap around that. Let me go find a family. This family here, their air conditioner broke. They live in an apartment complex who, they tried and they tried, but their landlord wouldn't fix the air conditioner, even though it was broken through the summer. So now that brings it down to a human element. Now my brain can understand that, see the real world impacts of this very complex science, and I can put it together and I can understand it more. So when it comes to storytelling, that human aspect is incredibly important because again, you may not be able to see it yourself, but if I can show you where that's impacting your neighbors or your friends or your coworkers, then it becomes much more of a relatable problem for you.
But Shell, I'm assuming it could also be a double-edged sword, considering there's a situation of doom and gloom. It's also like a story could sound to me something it's real, but it's too far. And second, it's something that makes me uncomfortable.
Sure. So I think we all fell into this, especially around COVID, when you're just scrolling on your phone and you see a lot of bad news, right? And you kind of shut off from it because we weren't expected as humans to take in that much bad news all at once. We weren't expected to know what was happening all around the world. Um, and it's not a bad thing that we do, but you just have to be able to find ways to cope with it. And I think the most important part of climate communication, and what I try to do when I did it on TV and for our news station, and what I still try to do in my job today, I think solutions based reporting is incredibly important. So, to bring it down to your conversations, solution based communication is incredibly important. You see the problem. Okay, that seems like it's huge, and that seems like it's not good, and I don't feel good about that at all. What can I do? What can you do in order to help solve the problem? Is it going and working with your community to try to start up a new program? Is it working with your community to maybe open up some cooling centers? Is it working with your apartment complex or your neighbors? Maybe you compost, but maybe everybody else doesn't. So maybe it's starting a compost that everyone can come to and teaching everybody to do that. What little things can you do for your community, for your area specifically, that can get you some action so that you can see the problem and try to feel better about working towards the solution of that problem? And then what can you do to spark action from other people, from your neighbors, from your coworkers, from policymakers? What can you do in order to try to work on this problem together? As long as there's an actionable item for you, I think it doesn't seem quite as daunting.
Shell, in this situation, we might assume that the person with whom we are talking is climate conscious. But there's so many times that we're talking about climate change with people who hold opposing views. In that situation, it's not only about convincing them, it's also about sensitizing them. What would you have to say about talking about climate change to a person who opposes you upfront, and I know that you've faced a lot of backlash over this during your tenure. So what do you want to?
Sure. Look, you can Google my name and you can find some of the darkest corners of the internet just bashing about the things that I talk about. Um, let me tell you, Facebook is not a kind place to talk about climate change sometimes. But I think I want to just make a little point before I answer that, which is I think as time went on, and especially as the impacts became more real for the area that I was reporting for, I didn't have to go into the comments as much to chat back with people because there were already people who had realized that something was changing and dove into the climate change of it, that then they would go into the comments and they would do that conversation for me, which was, I think, empowering for me to know that the message was getting out there and the understanding was coming together. There's a couple different things. One, I believe in the power of communication and conversation is not going to fix all of our problems, but it is a good place to start, right? There's a lot of things that just bad communication can cause the issue itself. And that could be from a friendship to a marriage to climate change, right? The other side of that, though, is I think if there's someone that is so far on the opposite side, that just is a denier, when you start talking with them, at some point you're going to realize that this person doesn't want to hear what you have to say. And I don't want to say ignore them, just forget about them. But at some point, that's not where your efforts need to be. Your efforts need to be where you can make actionable change, right? So if you get exhausted talking to one person that's a big time denier and they're just not going to come around to it, unfortunately, that's kind of the key there, right? We got to work with people who maybe see a signal of it or are interested in it and want to learn more. That's where you should put your efforts. One very good tool that I used is anytime that I put out some sort of information, I would say, here's the data to back it up. And I would include the links to whatever it is that I was reporting on. And somebody would come back inevitably and either say I was lying, or let's start there. Say I was lying and I'd say, okay, give me some information, send me some links that has science-backed, peer-reviewed, factual information. I will happily look at what you have to say. And I think that's important because a conversation is two ways. And if they sent it back, what I would do with it usually is you can go online, you can find like a media bias or a fact checker type website. And I would put it in. And if you can find out very quickly if these are disinformation websites or if they are just very one-sided leaning websites that aren't giving factual information, right? And when that would happen, then I would send it back and I'd say, hey, I looked at your articles, I ran through it. By the way, when you look at a bias tracker, this is funded by this company, which is a disinformation site, or this is, been disproven as wrong, or this is not complete science information that was very cherry picked to make it look like your side was right. And sometimes they'll come back. I think as many times as somebody would come back and forth with me, I would happily engage them. Sometimes they would just stop talking to me at that point. So I think everyone wants to be heard. So hear people, even if they are not giving you factual information, hear them and then tell them why what they are seeing is not true. And check your own resources as well before you get into these conversations. But that is a good way to at least engage that conversation and see where it goes from there. Because there's a lot of just bad information out there. There are people who, may not have done so hot in chemistry class in high school, but they will quickly discredit a scientist on social media. Don't give up on them at this point, but also know your limits and know that if somebody is there just to argue with you, or if they actually want to listen to what you have to say.
You highlighted some of the very important challenges that one can face while talking about climate communications. Do you want to expand that further and maybe talk about the challenges that you faced while communicating climate science? Because you started communicating science at that stage when, although science has always been the same, but it was not relatively accepted the same way as it is today. So do you want to talk about some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, and I had a much different situation because everything I did was so public facing, right? It's all out there for you. I was lucky to have a station that was very supportive in me talking about climate science. So again, I think the other thing too, especially last summer, again, 2023 summer for us was just record shattering on every single level: nighttime warmth, daytime warmth, hottest months, driest months, all of it. I think people heard it and people understood it. One thing I learned very clearly last summer, though, is there is a place that you can go too far, right? Because every single day I was like, here's the heat, here's the record, here's the climate impact. And at some point, I don't know if y'all have Nextdoor. Do you use the Nextdoor app at all? Do you know what it is? Okay. It's another one of those corners of the internet that's just interesting, but it's like Facebook, but for your city. So it's supposed to be like neighbors talking, and like if there's a lost dog, you can help find the dog. There is a big thread that went on for days, and then I think Nextdoor took it down. But it was about how much people hated listening to me talking about climate change and how annoyed they were because every day I was talking about climate change and like Texas is hot, so of course it's going to be hot. That's not climate. But then it turned into this big community-wide debate, which was kind of cool to see. Of the back and forth of people saying climate change isn't real, and then other people coming in and saying climate change is absolutely real, and this is why you're living it. So that was an interesting thing to see the most. But there's a moment when I think you're in the middle of it, and you understand that it is climate change, and you know that everybody else does as well. But again, sometimes those problems seem too daunting and too big, and you have to realize it's time to step back and let's just talk about the things you can do, right? A tangent for you. One December day, NOAA puts out a list of all the billion-dollar disasters that happen in the United States every year. So one year, December, they came out with their list. I never said the words climate or change. I just said NOAA today came out with this. Here's the billion-dollar disasters that we've seen this year. Last year it was this, so they've increased this many. And it wasn't 5 minutes, and I got an email from a viewer who said, I'm so sick and tired of you talking about climate change and blah, blah, blah. I just emailed back very kindly, and I said, and I clipped the whole segment that I did. I said, here's the segment. You'll notice that I never talked about climate change, but I'm glad that your mind quickly understood the reason behind a lot of these billion-dollar disasters. So again, people understand that it's there. It's just the question of, are they willing to admit, that we have categorically changed our climate and accelerated the warming process.
Congratulations for all the patience that you have. And I wish, all of us may be able to have that much patience to just have conversations with people who hold such different opinions and maybe, just try and convince them.
Sure. And the thing about it, I mean, we all just, you want somebody to be kind to you. You want to be kind to other people, I would hope at least, right? As just a good human, that's just how we should operate. So again, everybody wants to be heard. Everybody has an opinion. The question is, can we come together and understand? Some of my viewers and some of my trusted what we call weather watchers. So if we have a big rain event, they would send in their rain totals, right? They would they have said, we believe what Shell's forecast says, and we make our decisions based on it. Farmers, ranchers. One of the big ones I can think of right now is they have a Christmas tree farm in the winter and they grow berries in the summer. And they've been there for 50 years. And he said to me so many times, we've seen the changes. We know something's different. We just don't know if we can call it climate change. And here's the thing, at the end of the day, if you can't make that final push, or somebody you're talking to can't make that final push, well, we can agree that there's a change, and we can agree that there are things that we can do to adapt and mitigate those changes, then let's call that a win. Let's have that conversation instead. Instead of arguing about the name, let's talk about what we can do to slow down the warming, to stop using fossil fuels as much, to help the land stay healthy and fertile so that we can use it year after year. Those are the important conversations, not necessarily what we call it.
I think it would be great, if we back it up, all our discussion regarding climate communications, with one of the significant impacts or, tangible results that you saw coming out of your communication efforts, or, the work that you do, something tangible, with which we could all hope that one conversation at a time that we're having is making impact.
Right. So I think my biggest, what I call, I guess, personal win, if you will, just my biggest moment of like, I did something to help the climate solution. So where I live and where I reported for is Bryan College Station. And if you know Texas A&M University, we're located here. We're about 90 miles north of Houston, 90 miles east of Austin, Texas. So Climate Central, when I joined this organization, one, because I credit a lot of my success as a climate communication or communicator to them, to the resources that they provide to localize the data. There was a report they did that put a number on all the cities they analyzed for urban heat island effect, how concrete and buildings have warmed certain locations. So we did this big in-depth piece, and me and our main anchor were talking about it. And we talked about the score for Bryan College Station, which was a 6. And we talked about where it could feel hotter and where you could feel cooler in the city, right? So if you're near a park, obviously that's going to be a little cooler than if you're in a downtown area. But what you can do is submit to the EPA here in the United States your plans in order to mitigate the city's plans, that is, to mitigate heat. So the city can say, hey, we're going to incentivize new buildings, planting green space. Or if you're going to park or build a parking lot, we require that you have this many trees also in those plans and plant those as well. So I didn't do it rudely. I just, at the end of it, and I said, hey, we checked, by the way, neither Bryan nor College Station have these plans in place to mitigate urban heat island effect. And we're growing and we're building, but we don't have these plans in place. And it wasn't but a couple months later that the city of College Station, the city manager, put together a plan to submit to city council in order to enact a urban heat island effect mitigation plan. And they put it in. They used some of the graphics from Climate Central that I had used on TV. City council approved it, and now the city of College Station is requiring these new things. And just about 2 months ago, I think they led this big volunteer-driven event where they went and they planted a bunch of trees around Bryan College Station, or around College Station at least. So that was a good moment. And I think, to go back to one of your statements of like, this feels big, or people have other things going on in their lives, that's one of those moments where it's just a small little thing, but then it grew into such a big impact. And then it also gave other people abilities to work on the problem that feels so daunting, you know? you're just one person. Well, great. You can go and plant 5 trees on a Saturday afternoon.
Thank you so much for this, Shel. Inspiring. Before we begin to the interesting questions that were submitted to us, is there anything else that you would want to share with us?
No, I mean, be passionate about it. Again, it can be daunting. My friends always joke, when I read, I read a lot about climate change and I work in climate change. So they're like, man, you just really have like you're a negative space for your brain. Find some outlets though that can get you away from the daunting. An example of that is right now I'm reading a book about how climate change has impacted small towns in America by Jonathan Vigliotti from CBS News. The book I read before this was John Stamos's autobiography, right? So like find some empty time for your brain just to process and dump it all and not be so heavy in between the bigger moments of what you're learning.
Thank you so much, Shel. Now I think we
Yeah,
should move to the Q&A.
sure.
So Abhinandan has asked us that how an evidence-based communication approach can set the tone for a successful climate advocacy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to checking your sources and then checking the sources of somebody else. There's plenty of information out there. Doesn't mean that that information is good information or that it's timely information either. So make sure that you're checking your resources. Don't just say like, oh, you got this from X and X site, or you got this from Twitter X, whatever you want to call it. This isn't correct. This is inaccurate. You got to have some grace when you do that, because some people, that's where they get their information. They may not know that it's inaccurate information. I think it's important to like follow up if there's a change in it, and especially if maybe what you had was science backed and that was understood to be the correct information, and maybe there was an adjustment to that study or to that research. Make sure that you come back and you follow up, even if your information was maybe not the best now that it was when you first put it out as well. But math is math, right? Like math can't be changed. So it's kind of the same idea. Like if you have good research, and we have plenty of it out there, use those tools and use them well.
It goes back to your point of using data to back your argument. So an
Right.
evidence-based approach could help from that.
Exactly. But again, evidence as well can be a little bit boring, right? So use that to, like we talked about, the storytelling, the human aspect. What does that mean to you and to your neighborhood and to your community?
Anand is asking, what are the effective ways to counteract misinformation and myths about climate change that we see on social media platforms?
Yeah, again, fact check it all, and give something that, you know, not disproves it, but essentially disproves it, right? You see it out there, it's handed to you, or you see it on social media. Go ahead and reply. If you feel confident enough with it, put the accurate information, or look up the reasons why this has been discredited. We see them all the time. Find those accurate things that you can go in and you can come in and you can say, that's not right. And here's the reasons why. Here's the actual facts that go behind it.
I think you've already answered it, but Khyati is asking how important it is to incorporate emotional storytelling in climate communications.
100% every time, right? And it doesn't have to be, I think that's important too. It doesn't have to be end of the world every time. It can be those little things like, why is it a little hotter today? Or why is that thing missing that we love so much? But that's how you localize it. And I think if you're talking to family, especially, those family conversations are not easy. And a lot of times people try to stray away from them, but there's that one family member that's going to bring it up around the dinner table, right? So making it more emotional and making it more human is the way to have those communications, because at the base of it all, that's what we are. We're human, and we have to talk about how it's impacting us.
Simran is asking, how can we identify and mitigate our own biases when communicating about climate change?
That's an excellent question. And I think that is important. I think that goes back to the statement of that two-way conversation. You could be right. How many of us love being right? Right? I can't tell you, my wife is right 99% of the time in our marriage. But that 1% that I get, I make sure to be like, I just want to point out I was right here, right? We all like being right. Even if you know what the person is giving you is not accurate or is disinformation, again, we all just want to be heard. So take it in, look at it, evaluate it, listen to what they have to say, and then just say, this isn't right, and here's the reason why. Very gently. It doesn't have to be like, I'm right, you're wrong. Get behind me and listen, right? It's a back and forth. And that's the way to do it. You can't let disinformation continue or let somebody believe something that's wrong, because that's not going to help our situation. But here's the correct information. What do you think about it? And now what can we do together to go forward from here?
That's all that we have from the audience Q&A as well. Shel, before we conclude this conversation, Climate Central was very gracious to schedule this call and, have you with us here. Do you want to share some of the work that Climate Central is doing right now and something big that's coming up, which the listeners can look out for?
Absolutely. So one place you can go is climatecentral.org. That's the main website. There's a tab there that says resources. And a lot of it is going to be US based, but you can dig through and you can see how we try to take that localized data to craft those stories for meteorologists, for journalists, for city governments, for anybody who needs it, right? So see how that localized aspect works. But another thing you can find on our website is called the Climate Shift Index. And I talked about it a little bit earlier. So what the Climate Shift Index does is it takes the forecast, it puts attribution science into it so that we know how the warmth or the weather that's occurring on this specific day is being amplified or could be less likely because of climate change. Let's say you're having an unseasonably cool day. Well, there's also the attribution to know that a day like that may be so many times less likely to occur because of our warming climate that we've polluted. So the Climate Shift Index, if you know that it's a hot day, you can go and you can look and you can get that value so that when somebody just, weather's the thing we talk about to pass time, right? So when someone says, man, it's a hot one out there today, you could say, actually, we know that today is 3 times more likely to be hot on this day because of man-made climate change. And as we go into the summer, you can go, the paper's been published, it has been peer-reviewed. But what we're working on is not only the climate shift index and the attribution of surface temperatures, but also the attribution of the warmth of sea surface temperatures. So right now, sea surface, the fever that our oceans have is incredible, right? And we know, at least when we look at it from a United States standpoint, the tropical zone in the Atlantic, that we see waves come off of Africa and then travel across the Atlantic our direction, that water in the end of May is already as hot as what it would be in August. And that seems like a pretty big problem, right? We've submitted the science, so now we're working on giving you the tools so you can see the climate impact to the sea surface temperatures. And then as tropical waves move over those warmer waters, what kind of climate impact does it have on the intensity of hurricanes and tropical systems and cyclones as well? So that's going to be some very interesting data, especially considering the forecasts that are out there for tropical seasons across the globe, really.
Thank you so much for all these resources and the conversation, Shel. It was a delight to have you here.
I appreciate it. I'm on social media. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I'll always call it Twitter. I know it's called X. I'll always call it Twitter. Absolutely. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. I am happy to have the conversation with you as well.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of Is Climate Change Your Concern? This would not have been possible without the invaluable support of the Future Founders core team, and I'm grateful for that. One key takeaway from the episode is the power of localizing climate change conversations. By highlighting the human stories and impacts in our own communities, we make the issue feel less distant and more urgent. It's also crucial to focus on actionable solutions, empowering people to make a difference and avoid feeling overwhelmed by the problem's scale. Do let me know what you think about this episode. And if you enjoyed this, please subscribe and share it with your friends. See you next week.